Chairman. And thank you all very much for turning out this evening and joining us here. It's very nice to have a chance to reflect back on what happened during the Newick Park Initiative. I'm afraid I am going to tell you a number of stories that related to what happened at that time before giving a few thoughts about the future, but it was an opportunity to tell stories. That shows you I must be getting old, because I'm told that's what old people do, just go back and tell stories about the past. So forgive me if I ramble a little bit, but I hope some of what I say will be insightful in various ways. I have to accept responsibility for kicking off the NPI and how it started. And you could say, well, it's a story of human arrogance, or you could say it's a story of human faith. What happened was that I'd started the Keep Sunday Special campaign in Britain to try and overturn Mrs. Thatcher's bill to deregulate Sunday trading. This seemed a rather unpromising prospect when we started it in my house in February 1985, because she had a majority of 140 over all other parties combined. This was a situation that any political party today would dream to have. Totally impregnable, or so our opponents thought. And I won't go into the story of Keep Sunday Special now, much fun as it was, but the long and the short of it was that she lost the vote in April 1986 by 14 votes. That required 70 backbench Tories to rebel against the party whip and to defeat the government. And we were blessed with 14 Northern Ireland MPs who came over unexpectedly from Northern Ireland. We'd invited them, but they hadn't replied to our invitation. They went and hid at the bottom of the House of Commons and just turned up at 10 p.m. to vote. The result was we won that vote by 14 votes. I regard that as a miracle. I regard it as a miracle then. I regard it as a miracle now that we succeeded in defeating a government bill. And I think it was the first time in 100 years that a civil society group had defeated a government bill, and it certainly hasn't been repeated since. So I went down to South Africa that summer to visit my aunt who lived in Pietermaritzburg, and as I spent time around South Africa and went down into Soweto, it was all under lockdown. There were big Afrikaner guards, and they are massive people, those Afrikaner guards, inspecting your car and everything. I went to a trial of a black activist in Delmas. You know, it just seemed an impossible situation, but I thought, well, you know, if the Lord can overturn a government majority in Britain of 140, well, perhaps he could do something amazing in South Africa. That wasn't to assume that I was going to do all of that, of course. I wasn't even a South African, but perhaps we could make some small contribution. Is that sheer naivety? Is it faith? I think it's probably a little bit of both. But if you believe in a great God who does amazing things, and you've actually seen it happen right in front of you in your own lifetime, then it does encourage you to try the next project. So the first step was to approach my brother-in-law here in the chair, and my sister sitting over there, and ask them if they were willing to provide the chairmanship and the hostessing of a group of South Africans if we managed to persuade them to come over and have a conference with us and discuss the issues. And I'd like to say publicly that I'm eternally grateful to both of them for agreeing to do that, because it was their hospitality and their willingness to accept that responsibility that made the whole Newick Park Initiative possible. And it really is most appropriate that it was called the Newick Park Initiative, because it was grounded in their home and in their hospitality. So Jeremy was in my house group at church, as he recalled, and because of his connections into South Africa, he knew who to go and speak to, and had the sensitivity and the political, just the political experience and nous, and just the skill to be able to determine who are the right people to invite here, and if we invite somebody from this political party, how is this political party going to react to that? It's all this kind of knowing who's who and who's connected to who, and how are they relating to each other, which I could never have begun to understand if Jeremy had not taken on this responsibility, again, Newick Park would never have happened. Now, there was a methodology that was really important that underpinned what we did. And Jeremy has referred to it, but I'm just going to spell it out. We, in the end, wrote it up in a book called The R Factor in 1993. So it's there in writing, and in fact it's become the basis of a whole industry that is growing up now to measure stakeholder relationships in companies around the world. But at that time we had not kind of discovered it. We kind of stumbled into it by intuition, or perhaps by the guidance of the Holy Spirit, I should say. But the 5 areas that were key to this succeeding were these. Firstly, we needed to get the key players to meet face-to-face. And you might say, well, aren't they meeting face-to-face in conferences all the time? And the answer is no. A lot of these participants, these fairly senior players, never have a chance to have a face-to-face conversation with people who are demonized by their own constituency and for whom they are demonized by the other side. So they never sit down and have a conversation. And it's much harder, you know, to think of somebody as a demon once you have sat with them and had a meal and talked to them face to face and heard their story. And one of the things that Crispin did as chairman was, at the beginning of every consultation, he'd go around the room and get people to tell their stories. And you began to see people as human beings. Secondly, it was very important that there was continuity. Jeremy referred to the fact people came back over and over again. That was really important, because to get to know another person well, it's very difficult to do it in one meeting. But when people come over and over again, then you begin to see them in a slightly different light, and you feel you get to know them as people, and some depth develops in the relationship. Thirdly, you need to know them in multiple situations if you possibly can. That is the hardest part of getting to know people in this kind of peace process, because certainly between the ANC and the white establishment, you couldn't just go around and have a cup of tea in their house. You might be able to do that in Khartoum, and some of the people in our Sudan initiative used to do that. Just go and talk informally in a totally different context. But this, what we call multiplexity, many-sidedness in the relationship, gives you a fresh view of the person that you are talking to in an official capacity. The 4th area we call parity or fairness. It's a matter of people feeling that they're treated exactly the same. It was a really important part of what we did and of the chairman's role that he never, for example, told the government people that they could speak first. Or the Broederbond, who came to our meetings. The chairman of the Broederbond came, and he was not given special preferential treatment because he was chairman of the Broederbond and a key white Afrikaner player. It was vital that people from the ANC, even from the PAC, were treated as if they were simply players on a level playing field. But the most difficult aspect, I think, in these kinds of initiatives is that you have to create what we call commonality. You have to build up shared values and shared goals. And I don't think you can reach that just by dialogue. I think you have to have a research effort going on behind, which gets to understand the issues in depth and begins to explore what you could do or how you could shift things to create a situation where both sides could see an interest in buying into a shared solution. If you don't do that hard work, if you do not do the research, you'll have great dialogues, but I don't believe you will ever really take the whole process forward towards a solution. So there's no shortcuts to this, it's a lot of hard work. So we got into writing research papers, and I wanted just to reflect on that for a few moments, because I was in charge of the research program, so it's sort of my piece of the jigsaw. So we had, at the beginning of each conference, a Christian principles paper. So we would reflect on land ownership and distribution, or on ownership of mines and other mineral resources and ownership of banks, that kind of thing, from a theological point of view. And one of the authors of those papers, who actually wrote a paper with me, is in the front row here, Alex Bakerfield de la Roche. She and I wrote a paper believe it or not, on Christian principles for public administration. What on earth are the Christian principles for public administration? Well, I had no idea when we started writing that paper what we were going to say, but it was a great experience, and I do regard it still as an absolutely excellent paper, and perhaps the Jubilee Centre needs to republish it. Although I was one of the co-authors, I say it myself in that sense. But anyway, at the beginning of each conference, we had a Christian principles paper to try and set the tone for what we were looking at and try and bring out these ethical principles and values and put them on the table. Now, when we had the ANC present, as we did in that third phase, and we had very senior people from the ANC, Max Sisulu came, he was head of the Economic Policy Unit for the ANC, son of Walter Sisulu. We had Zola Square-Year, head of the Land Commission. We had all of these senior guys sitting around the table. And I remember at one point, Zola Square-Year, we wanted to write a joint statement at the end, and Zola Square-Year was in the room, and it started off, we as Christians meeting at Newick Park have come to these conclusions, da-da-da-da-da. And one of the guys in the ANC said to Zola Square-Year, head of the Land Commission, are you willing to say that? Are you willing to say that we are here meeting as Christians, or at least as sympathetic to Christianity? And I thought it was a defining moment in Zola Square-Year's life when he said, yes, I am. Incidentally, he was here as High Commissioner for South Africa in London until about 6 months ago. Otherwise, I'm sure we'd have got him here in the room. So, let me just talk to you a little bit about two of the key issues we looked at and just reflect on where those issues are today, because it's really interesting now, looking back 25 years since that conference, as to where things have got to. So we got interested, particularly in the land issue, who should own the land? And the Freedom Charter in 1955 had promised the ANC that they were going to nationalise all the land in South Africa. So you can imagine how popular that was with the Afrikaner establishment, that all the land was going to be taken away from the farmers. And most of the large farms in South Africa, and you're talking thousands or tens of thousands of hectares in some cases, those biggest farms are controlled by only 4,000 farmers, or they were at that time. 86% of the agricultural production came in South Africa off those farms. Most of the agricultural production that was feeding the black communities in the homelands was consumed within the homelands. It was not coming out into the cities. And therefore the country was entirely dependent on white farmers to feed black urban communities. So we had people write a range of papers. What had gone on with transfer of land in Zimbabwe, very relevant as it turned out later, in Kenya and elsewhere. What were the policy options that the government could pursue for land ownership transfer? Several things became clear to me. One was that what had happened when the whites had gone into South Africa was to drive African farming into very small pockets, and generally of not the best land. I have to say, I felt very deeply ashamed as a white person looking at how marginalised the black farming community had been made. It was really absolutely shocking to see the situation of the black farming community. So you had no black farmers who were trained and able to take over the white farms. They may have been tractor drivers, they may have had the technical knowledge, but they didn't have the management knowledge. And if you're simply a tractor driver, you're not thinking about the long-term viability of some pretty fragile soils across some parts of South Africa. So how on earth do you transfer this land into black ownership if that's your ambition? And what we said in our proposals to the ANC was you needed to set up a long-term committed strategy to train up black farmers, put them through agricultural college, get them into apprentice schemes on white farms, and train them up to the point when they were ready to take ownership of those farms and then be willing to finance them. It was going to be a long-term, difficult process if you didn't want to have a collapse of your production. And we warned the ANC that if they simply kicked out these white farmers, which would be very popular with some parts of the population, all their foreign exchange would then go from importing industrial raw materials to importing agricultural products. And then their industrial production would simply collapse. So if they wanted to maintain urban employment, they had no alternative but to let those white farmers continue as they were until they could train up this new cohort. Tragically, what has happened since that time is that the ANC has not gone through with the program of training that was required. They lost focus on agriculture when they got into power. There was much more money to be made much quicker in banking and mining and so on, and they lost sight of it. But the Africans, who think about land very differently from Westerners, it is for them a source of identity as much as it's a source of income. And many of them had lost their farms in various, after various acts of parliament by the white establishment, 1913, 1935 and so on, where they've been pushed off and pushed off and pushed off. These black people wanted their farms back again, understandably. We're now in a situation where about 7% of white farmers are being murdered every year in South Africa. Get your heads around that. 7%. And the story is that a gang will come up to the farm, they'll go into the house, and they will simply kill the man in the house. They won't touch the women or the children. They just shoot the man in his bed or wherever they can get hold of him, and then they exit. They don't take any goods with them. It's entirely politically motivated killing. They make it absolutely clear this is about ownership of our land. And that is a very threatening situation today in South Africa, given how much that agricultural production is still essential for the economy of the country. The other area we looked at was the nationalisation of banks and of mines. Now, in the research process, we've got somebody to write a paper on nationalisation of banks in France, Mexico, and Brazil. Those were the three countries that had tried it. David Porteous, who wrote it, was a trained accountant from South Africa doing a PhD in economics at Yale. He was well positioned, well qualified to write the paper. He brought the evidence together and wrote a very compelling case, I think, for Max Sisulu and his colleagues. Tito Mboweni was there as well, who went on to become governor of the Reserve Bank of South Africa. So we had the senior people in the room, and he wrote this paper saying, look, if you nationalise the banks, you're likely to denationalise them again after 5 years. It's going to cost you a bomb, and there are better ways. If you want to transfer lending into small African hands, there are better ways to finance African business than to nationalise the banks. So let the banks go, let them run, but start to put in directors onto their boards, start to require them to lend certain amounts into the black African sector, divert the lending, and these are the kinds of strategies that you can use without shaking up the whole country. So you might say, well, where has that got to? You may remember last year, 39 miners were killed tragically in a strike. You need to realize that the pay differentials now between the top of these companies and the miners and others at the bottom are about 1,000 to 1. 1,000 to 1. That means somebody has to work 1,000 years as a miner to get the income of the top guys working in these companies. Same in supermarkets, same in a whole range of industries. These are staggering, staggering differentials. And of course they're greater than the UK, where it's only 500 to 1, only 500 to 1, because incomes in the bottom end of the South African workforce are so low, and that's because it's a low-income country. There were some indications that we may have influenced policy in South Africa. That is about a month, as I recollect, after these conferences we held on the land and on the banks. There were policy announcements coming away from nationalisation by the ANC. Whether we were key to that, we can never prove, because we don't know what went on within the ANC at the time. But again, I think the ANC has really struggled to know what to do with the mines and a lot of the big industry. They realise that there are problems if they take them over. They don't want to shake confidence in foreign investment into South Africa. They have taken over one of the mining groups now, and we'll see how they get on with that, because it's relatively recent. But there are all kinds of strains and difficulties, and I don't want to just paint a negative picture of these mining companies. I've spoken to some of their leadership. It is very difficult for them to know how to attract the labour, how to balance the needs of treating the labourers fairly, and how to maintain the investment into the companies from the international community, where the shareholders are simply looking at what returns they can get. I must push on a little faster. Our chairman mentioned the problem of funding the initiative. As I was in charge of that, let me comment on it briefly. It's actually a more important issue than you might think. Unless you can raise some money, you can't keep going. And we did find, I found it, all of us involved found it really a complete nightmare. We managed to get 3 companies to put in £10,000 each. Now, if you think about all the airfares, the payments for the research, the payments for hospitality, the maintenance of a secretariat to run the organisation and everything, £10,000 doesn't go a very long way, nor does 30,000. I think it is really significant that most of the money for this initiative came from Christians. It was Christians, obviously, who could afford to contribute 10, 20,000, some who produced 5,000, some 1,000, some 500, some 100, some £5. But a lot of Christians gave money to NPI, and without that explicit Christian support, it would have collapsed. And I mention that because if you look, for example, at the Track 1 initiative going on in parallel, it was all funded by Consgold, an enormous industrial conglomerate for whom funding a couple of £100,000 a year was simply not an issue. But, of course, they come with their own agenda. And they did a great job, I think, in facilitating that dialogue between the ANC leadership and the white political leadership. I don't want to diminish it at all, but it was a very different kind of task that they were undertaking than what we were doing. At the end, we had a £50,000 deficit. And I remember my wife going around the neighbourhood in Cambridge wondering where we were going to move house, because we might have to sell the house to fund the deficit. We never had to. God is very kind and good. A Dutchman who was importing oranges and other fruit from South Africa stepped up and paid the £50,000. And Brian, you probably remember Case Miller, who actually provided those funds at the time. He died of cancer, tragically, about 7 or 8 years ago, but I do thank God for the memory of him. The role of the Jubilee Centre in all this, NPI was launched by the Jubilee Centre, it was managed by the Jubilee Centre, it operated out of what we call Jubilee House in Cambridge. They looked after the administration and the accounts, they looked after the conference organisation, together with my sister Jill when it was at Newick Park, and then we moved down to, what's the name of the place? Ashburnham, that's right, thank you. Moved down to Ashburnham for some of the later conferences. And they helped with the fundraising, but I'd like to emphasise the spirit of prayer, because there was a great deal of prayer around this whole initiative. And Jubilee House was a great centre to have prayer, because we were, to some extent, a praying community. Well, we were a praying community, and the work of NPI was always high on the agenda. In what sense was it a Christian initiative then? Well, I think a lot of the people came, particularly at the beginning. As it got more and more sort of high level, people would come because they wanted the political connections. But in those early stages as we built up, a lot of people came because it was a Christian initiative and they just felt they wanted to back it. So Donald Anderson, who was the shadow Foreign Affairs, wasn't he, with particular responsibility for South Africa. I'm sorry he isn't here tonight, but he gave us very strong support from the beginning. Elmar Brok, who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the European Parliament, he came. I had a special route to him, as it turned out, because our sons had done an exchange at school, so we'd had his son in our house for a while. But Elmar Brok came for that reason. Sir Fred Catherwood, our local MEP, was a vice president of the European Parliament, but a very committed Christian. Again, I think that's why he gave it his backing. Walter Kansteiner, who you just heard, was a very senior person in the US State Department and became Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. He was contacted through a friend in Washington, a minister called Chris Hancock, who knew him from the Virginia Theological College. So again, it was a Christian and theological connection that originally drew him to take interest, I think, and decide that he would spend time coming over to Britain and participating. But once he got into it, of course, he realized the potential of it, and he would come back over and over again. Again, people writing research papers, how do we persuade them to spend the time? Generally, it was out of their Christian interest and conviction that they decided they'd spend the time. I see Alex nodding her head in the front row here. It's probably the Christian interest that engaged you in the first place. And that would be true for quite a lot of people. I remember Tony Lemon, a teacher in geography at Oxford, a lecturer there. I think getting into it for that reason. It was quite a lot of work to write an extra paper. He was a very busy senior fellow in Mansfield College, but he wrote a paper for us. So did Anthony Asher, professor of actuarial science at one of the big universities in Johannesburg. These people were all coming out of that Christian conviction and wanting to make a contribution. I think if we hadn't been able to appeal to that Christian interest, I'm not sure we would have got those research papers written. We did produce, in the end, 91 research papers. Many of them were commented on and responded to by black participants. And some of the black participants wrote the papers as well. It wasn't entirely a set of white people who wrote them. But getting 91 research papers was quite an effort. And just looking down the list as I was coming here tonight, I thought, actually, there'd be quite a strong case for publishing those in South Africa now, because a lot of them dealt with a lot of the thorny issues, and although they're 20 years old, I'm not sure that the issues have moved on in every case that much. So just one or two lessons for the future. NPI provided a model, a framework, a worked example. As Jeremy has rightly said, it got applied in Rwanda, or we tried to apply it in Rwanda, but failed in a sense, because when we tried to bring the parties together, the Hutus and the Tutsis and so on, the Hutus obviously were in exile, we found the whole thing was too raw. There were too many people who'd had their, lost their wives, their children, and other close relatives butchered in the genocide. They were simply not ready to come into the room and say, we'll move on. And I think that was our mistake, not to realize how traumatized people were on both sides of the debate, but I suppose more the Tutsis at that point than the Hutus. But there were definitely Hutus too who'd lost people in very violent circumstances as the Tutsi army invaded into Rwanda at the time. So what we ended up doing there was I was an agricultural economist, I'd worked with the World Bank, the International Food Policy Research Institute and so on. I drew in my connections from IFPRI in Washington, a world expert on fertilizer use, John Mellor, probably one of the leading experts on food production in the world. I brought them down to Rwanda and they advised the Rwandan government how to get agriculture moving. John Mellor, a brilliantly analytical mind, analysed that the genocide could be traced back from a food point of view to 1986. That was about 8 years before the genocide broke out. And he just said, from 1986, agricultural production per head started going down in Rwanda. And so, in a sense, you were bound to have outbreaks of violence. It was just that the Hutus used the political tension that was rising for ethnic cleansing purposes. But you could see the origins of it in what was happening on the food production side. And the reason the food production was going down, he said, was because the donor community had decided that Rwanda should not use fertilizers. They said, it's too far from the coast, fertilizers are too expensive, and therefore you shouldn't use fertilizers, just use cow dung. But if you've got a population growth rate of 4% a year, you're doubling your population every 17 years, on a fixed piece of land where you can't expand the area under cultivation, how on earth can you get the increase in yields that you need to feed that growing population? You just can't do it. So we had to start introducing to the Rwandan government how to use fertilizer and how to use it in a responsible way, and also bring in expertise on how to create the jobs to create the political stability that was necessary after the genocide. And we got to know the Minister of Agriculture extremely well, and he was very open to this kind of assistance. I'm just going to go back on one point that I missed, because I think it was really important. Washington Akumu is a most remarkable man. Not always the easiest person to corral, but he is a quite remarkable man, and he was the person who fixed this deal between the ANC and Inkatha at the very last minute. We're talking 2 weeks before the election. They had to recall Parliament, overprint the voting papers, and they couldn't do that without recalling Parliament. They had to do it at that level. So I asked Michael Cassidy of Africa Enterprise, when I was down in South Africa in February and March this year, I asked him, how important was Washington Akumu's intervention at that time? How significant really was it? And Michael Cassidy said, look, I was in the heart of Natal, where all of the violence was going on between the ANC on the one side and Buthelezzi's followers on the other. I was right there. And I can tell you that the United States State Department, thank you. The US State Department had predicted to him that 100,000 people would be killed in Natal alone if there was no peace between Inkatha, Buthelezzi's crowd, and the ANC, and that in Johannesburg and Pretoria there would be such a huge bloodletting that the whole election would collapse. If you go to the Apartheid Museum, they record Washington Akumu's intervention. But I think it paid the politicians at the time to sweep it under the carpet because they didn't want to seem to appear to be relying at that point on anybody who'd come from overseas, and Professor Akumu was from Kenya. But I never think he got the full credit from the international community that he really deserved for that quite astonishing intervention. So I'm just going to finish with this thought, that I think there is great room for Christian initiatives. And it's interesting now that people are starting to come to us both at a city level and at an international level talking about peace initiatives, but these are Christians looking for a Christian organization to help them with it. And I think that is significant, and you can see from what I said that if you do an explicitly Christian event or process, you have the advantage of drawing in people as participants to do research and so on. It opens up a lot of key opportunities. At the same time, it leaves you inevitably struggling for cash, because if you want money increasingly from the British government or from the European Union and so on, it is increasingly difficult to access that cash if you say that you're based on Christian values and principles. They really are much happier if you're working in a secular environment. Ironically, certainly in Sudan, all the Sudanese contacts that I've had have said to me, we would much rather we were dealing with a Christian agency than a secular agency. So the problem is not on the ground among the northern Sudanese, or among the Rwandans, or among the South Africans. They don't mind if you're coming from a Christian position. It's us Western institutions that are not prepared to fund it. And I'd lastly like to emphasize the role of prayer and faith. Perhaps if you really have to rely on the Lord for money, you rely on him much more for everything. And I think that's a very important observation. Money is seldom actually the defining issue. And I think if we're going to look at Christian engagement in this area in the future, we've got to be prepared to do it very much on the basis of faith and prayer, and perhaps that's not such a bad thing. Thank you.